I started watching The Simpsons about 3 years ago. I'd been aware of the show basically my whole life, like a lot of us, but I had never tried it out for myself. I also didn't feel any of the reverence that the show usually attracts from animation fans. I watched the first 16 seasons of The Simpsons over the course of a few months, and it didn't take long to appreciate why the Golden Age episodes are so fondly remembered even today. And I kind of understood why it was such a big cultural phenomenon when it first hit the scene. I stopped at season 16 because that's when I realized that I just wasn't laughing anymore. All of the same comfortable, familiar elements were still there, and for a lot of sitcoms, that would be enough. But it wasn't enough for me, and based on what I've heard from other people, it hasn't been enough for them either. I had just stopped caring about the Simpsons family, and the noticeable change in animation style had removed a lot of the charm that those very early seasons had a whole bunch of. Ever since, I've tried to dip in occasionally, watching some of the new episodes here and there. They're pretty empty, as I expected. It's zombie Simpsons, like everyone says, and if I rewatch anything, it's going to be from seasons 3 through 12, guaranteed. Anytime I've heard someone talk about The Simpsons online, the same points tend to get brought up. The show used to be good, and it's not anymore. End of story. But for as much as everyone seems to agree on this, I haven't seen any discussions on what could make the current iteration of The Simpsons better. So I'm going to try to do just that. I'll take a very brief look at why the Golden Age Simpsons worked so well, then I'll brainstorm some ideas that I think would revive some of that decades-old love for this show, a show that used to be filled with cutting-edge American comedy. No one knew it back in the late 1980s, but television was destined to become the last outpost for 2D animation in pop culture. It's been a good 10 years since Disney abandoned 2D animation for their feature films, but we still have plenty of options on TV for animated sitcoms. The big ones are still all on Fox, of course, but there are plenty of original shows from streaming services now too. Some are really terrible, and some have been pushing the limits of this weird little subgenre. But the big lesson here is that 2D animated comedies aimed at adult audiences are still seen as financially viable. It's very easy for me to forget that there was once a time when animated television was actually fringe. Prior to The Simpsons, animation was for kids, whether on TV or the big screen. Sure, the art house world has had a thing for experimental and sometimes disturbing animated shorts for a very long time, but that stuff did not cross over to mainstream audiences. As a lot of fans already know, The Simpsons started out as a sketch segment of the Tracy Ullman Show. Apparently, people really enjoyed those early sketches. I mean, I don't. They're kind of awful to me, but what I do see in those prototype versions of the Simpsons characters we all know and love is that they were definitely bold and different. If you knew any animation majors in college, then you're probably familiar with these kinds of animated shorts that don't have much of a story or even a point. It's mostly about the art itself and the animation, the movement. The story and the characters are secondary, and that's totally fine, and that's also what the early Simpsons stuff feels like to me. But maybe the biggest reason for the immediate success of The Simpsons idea is that kernel of satirical humor. Animation requires a different kind of suspension of disbelief from the audience, which then allows the animated content to do whatever it wants. It can talk about mundane social interactions, it can create a wild fictional universe, or, like The Simpsons, it can satirize aspects of daily life and shared culture that we tend not to look at too closely.
Rock-a-bye, baby, in the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. And down will come baby, cradle and all.
And that's something I want to highlight while we're still talking about the very early years of this show. The Simpsons was edgy, at least for the time. It's hard to grasp that idea now because, what was edgy back in 1990 is not now at all, by a long shot, but Matt Groening has a bit of a history as a provocateur. In fact, back in college, he ran this student newspaper zine kind of deal that would publish comics and all kinds of stuff. And he proudly announced at some point that he would publish anything, even if it seemed like really outlandish or initially offensive. And keep in mind that this was many decades ago when subversion in art still belonged to the political left, long before the alt-righters appropriated it for their own awful purposes. A fun fact, by the way, one of Groening's schoolmates was cartoonist and professor Linda Barry, who made it her mission to make comics that even Groening would reject. And if you're familiar with her work, then that probably makes a lot of sense. Okay, so it's not surprising that The Simpsons had some of that flavor right from the start. When other writers got hired on for this brand new primetime show, they did a pretty great job of ramping that aspect up a whole lot. But satire of American culture was only one big ingredient. That was the quote-unquote smart side of the show, but The Simpsons also had just a lot of dumb jokes. And I really do mean that in the best way. There are so many episodes that are just comedic perfection. The timing is perfect. The storyline actually has some kind of heart. And more than anything, there are just so many jokes, and they're all delivered completely straight. It never feels like the show is laughing at itself. It's just funny.
I'm surprised you haven't been skipped. You're obviously smart enough. Well, I'm sure I could have, but I'd hate to leave behind all my wonderful friends. Out of the way, brain queen! Hey, Sarah!
Hey, why, that sounds like Gabriel's trumpet. You know what that means, kids?
Yay! Judgment Day! Lisa, what's the answer to number 7? Sorry, Ralph. That would defeat the purpose of testing as a means of student evaluation. My cat's name is Mitten. Why would they come to our concert just to boo us?
So why do we hate zombie Simpsons so much? Is the new stuff really that bad, or are fans just upset that the show changed into something that they weren't so comfortable with? You know what? Just to test that out, I'm going to go ahead and watch the latest episode right now and see if that helps us find some answers. Well, okay. I'm gonna try not to be mean. I'm gonna be fair. Gonna be a critic. It's gonna be great. Okay. It's not that bad. It's fine. And maybe that's part of the problem. There were a couple of decent jokes in this episode that I watched, and a whole lot of just like referential humor, you know, acknowledging something from pop culture, and that's it. Like there's no joke, they just kind of reference it. But I think the change in the show's visuals is kind of representative of the larger issue. It just looks bland. It blends in with all the other digitally animated TV comedies out there, which, you know, is all of them. In the first few seasons, The Simpsons was still pretty creative from a visual standpoint. It was clearly hand animated, and there were plenty of fun visual gags. Obviously, the show also looked pretty rough too, but that was part of the fun, and it's definitely part of what makes it so enjoyable to rewatch old episodes. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say the other aspects of the show have followed a similar arc. Once upon a time, they were unique, but now they're just fine. Serviceable, but not really worth a second look. It used to be special, and now it's not. It used to be special, and now it's not. It used to be special, and now it's not. It used to be special, and now it used to be special, and now it used to be special, and now it's not anymore. That's the overwhelming feeling when I watch modern-day Simpsons episodes. The term Zombie Simpsons is perfect because that's what it feels like. It's just overstayed its welcome many times over, and it just doesn't feel like it has anything left to give us. But is that really true? Could The Simpsons be good again? Well, I won't keep you on the line. My answer is yes. I think it could be. What I've come up with here is not a resuscitation plan for the show. It's not going to bring The Simpsons back from the dead and keep it going for another 10 years. That's not really my goal. As it stands now, if nothing changes, the show will just stay on life support until it's no longer financially viable, and it'll slip off slowly, and no one will really care. Instead of bringing The Simpsons back to life, for an extended period of time, we're just going to do one huge blowout of a final season. And that's going to be a big part of the marketing push, too. Everyone needs to know that the show is ending. That way, even if they haven't watched The Simpsons for years, or haven't watched it at all in general, people will still be curious right away. Some of them might say, oh, I thought they ended that back in like 2005, but that's okay. They don't even know. They don't even know how cool it's going to be and all the stuff we're going to throw at them, because this final season of The Simpsons is going to blow the zippers right off audiences worldwide. It's going to generate buzz all over the place. More and more viewers will pile on as the episodes build up steam, and animated shows have nice long seasons, so everyone can hop on the bandwagon before it comes tumbling off the cliff and blows up. It's gonna be so cool. The basic idea is to hit the nostalgia thing hard. And yeah, I know it's not great to lean too hard on nostalgia in general with media creation, and I think it can kill creativity and make for some bad entertainment, and it has. But we're talking about the final season of The Simpsons here. It's perfectly possible to reference the show's legendary history in the final episodes. It's a great way to bring the lapsed viewers back into the fold, and it could even get new viewers wondering about the old stuff that those episodes are referencing. Having this wealth of nostalgia and never using it is like buying some crazy supercar and just leaving it in the garage. It goes, man. Use it. You have no idea how far it can take you. But we're not just talking about soulless references to old episodes that everybody loves. We're not doing clip shows here. Instead, the final season is going to tie up some loose ends and put these characters to rest. And the model we're going to use for all of this? Well, it's a classic of TV show finales in general. It's the time jump. The most recent example I could think of this one is the Parks and Rec finale from several years ago at this point. But imagine that idea stretched over an entire season. I also think a fun world-building aspect here would be the same kind of retro future time jump that they've used before. Because right now, the characters haven't aged, but they've still moved on to new technologies over decades, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So for this time jump in the show, set it in like 2020, but like what we thought 2020 would be back in the 80s. This could make for some really fun gags while also avoiding the painful references to modern day pop culture that they keep using in the show right now. All of our characters are older for the final season, obviously. Not too crazy old. It would be safe to use the same kind of amount of time jump that they had in the Lisa's wedding episode, if you remember that one. Homer and Marge are kind of grayed out, but they're not so old that it's sad. Instead, everyone's aging just makes us sad in the nostalgic way, in the same way that we get happy sad when we look at old photos of family members. Things aren't necessarily worse now, but they are different, and that can hurt in a really nice way. And aside from the larger plot points that address elements of old episodes and character traits, this final season should also just have a boatload of Easter eggs for the hardcore fans. Just tons of tiny details that make you feel smart when you notice them. It's just another way to remind fans how much they love the old stuff and how much of it there is. So those are the broad strokes. Now let's talk about some more specific aspects. For the final season, I want the show to look the way it used to look. In an ideal world, it would be 100% hand animated on actual paper and then scanned in, but that's not how animated TV is done anymore, and it's rarely even animated in the US at all. I would probably be fine with just using some cheap filter that makes the footage look like it's from the 90s. That also means cranking up the brightness and the saturation. I love how vibrant the colors are in the early seasons. It's still a show for grown-ups a lot of the time, but Springfield felt fun and inviting. I mean, it's a comedy for Pete's sake. If at all possible, I want some creative visuals here, maybe even some fun little sequences like the ones for Homer falling asleep at the wheel or imagining the land of chocolate, that kind of stuff. Outside of that, I just want the visuals to be creative. We know that The Simpsons has made just an insane amount of money by this point, so how about putting some of that money back into the show? Maybe Matt Groening could sell off, one of the Tuscan villas I'm sure he has and pay like a horde of art school kids to animate the final season right here in California. Give them some freedom. It would be a nice nod to Groening's college days while also guaranteeing some crazy creative visuals. Who knows, it might even introduce the general public to some great new animators who haven't had a very big platform to showcase their work prior to this. So it would definitely be a great gimmick to bring back some of the old writers. A lot of them are still alive, so that's fine, that could work. But I also don't think that's a very creative way to reinvigorate the show's sense of humor. It's completely possible to hire younger writers who are currently working to do the job instead, especially if you give them free rein to rip off the style of those early seasons. You could even take submissions. I mean, can you imagine how many modern day comedy writers would love the chance to write for The Simpsons officially? A ton of comedians are also fans of the old show. They know the style inside out and they're talented enough to recreate it. For this final season, we want lots of jokes. Just so many jokes. Pack the thing up with jokes the whole way through. We'll still leave time for sentimental moments, but creating humor with heart was such an important part of the Golden Age Simpsons that it would need to come back before the show went away for good. The storyline for the final season is probably the trickiest part. An entire season to wrap up the show, I mean, that's a lot of time, and there's a lot of ground to cover. So instead of having the kind of story we saw in the movie, where the whole town has to come together to do something, let's just head in the direction of growth. Parks and Rec pulled this off really well in the finale, even if that last episode wasn't actually funny, just mostly sappy and even more sappy. So as we revisit our favorite side characters from The Simpsons, we see them moving on. No, they're not all leaving town or dying or something, but they are growing as people. Maybe Barney is 3 years sober by this point, but he still comes to Moe's because he's restarting his music career and the acoustics in the bathroom are just killer. Maybe Krusty could go back to being a touring stand-up. He doesn't even need the money at this point. He's just trying to be less of a hack. Mr. Burns has long since retired, but he still has Obey-style posters of himself all around the power plant. Smithers is running the place at this point, and he's out of the closet now, but it's not really made a big deal of. It's just a thing that happened. And of course, the Simpsons family is at the center of it all. Lisa could run a nonprofit right in Springfield. Bart could have a family, and maybe he's comically boring now, while Milhouse is trying way too hard to be a cool bad boy. Maggie is kind of a wild card. Her personality hasn't really been decided yet, so she could be doing just about anything. The forgotten Simpson sibling will finally have a chance to shine. I mean, that sounds pretty fun to me. Marge has started a somewhat successful art career, and she makes more money than Homer. If there's any character that needs to be fixed by the final season, it's Homer. Even if he's not officially the show's main character, it's definitely felt that way for a while. When we think of The Simpsons, we think of Homer. His head alone could be the logo for the series. Problem is, Homer hasn't been funny for a very long time, at least in my eyes. Even during the Golden Age, Homer just wasn't very likable. I mean, he's selfish, he's sexist, he's irresponsible, he's unwilling to improve in general. It's possible to make a stupid character like that funny, but for the most part, Homer is my least favorite part of all my favorite episodes. I think it's time for him to be redeemed, and he doesn't even need to be at the focus of the final season, he just needs to be made likable. The episode Lisa's Wedding kind of did this. He was still his old, stupid self, but he was genuine and thoughtful too. I think it's possible for Homer to change. Now that he's not supporting the family, he doesn't even really need to work anymore. He has to find purpose while also dealing with his inevitable feelings of emasculation or getting older, because of course he would be traditional enough to think that the man needs to bring home the bacon. Maybe Bart and the wife have their first kid towards the end of the season, and Homer realizes that while he was never a very good parent, he's a really good grandparent He's ready to take a back seat. He's making amends, trying to be a good person, and reflecting on his past. If we want to steal something from Mad Men, we could have Homer converse with like a sentient, imagined television or like a donut, which would give him the chance to explore some interesting things without bothering other characters with really on-the-nose dialogue. As for themes, I think it's pretty obvious that the show should end on the concept that, family is important and that it gets you through all of life's wacky adventures. And we could even define family as, something kind of loose so that other characters who are not technically Simpsons can be included in this thematic thing. It's not a very original theme, but it's one of the show's only consistent ideas, and the general public has spent so much time with The Simpsons over the last 30 years that it's time to cash in on all that familiarity. Let us feel the weight of all that time, those many, many hours of just being with these characters through both funny and very unfunny times. If you really want to get artsy, you could tease a kind of cyclical thing. Maybe another family is moving into the old Simpsons home, and while these new characters are very different from the Simpsons family, we can tell right away that they're going to have their own set of crazy adventures. Rather than setting up an actual spin-off show, this represents how the show's ending would be making room for something new on television. Imagine that. Maybe now Fox will greenlight some other crazy animated show to continue the animation domination tradition. The most important thing the final season of The Simpsons could give us is closure. So many shows die unceremonious deaths, and they don't even get to have real endings. But networks and showrunners can actively avoid that. They can decide to let a show end with dignity. The Simpsons needs to move over and make room. If there's a massive fan backlash when the show goes off the air, great. Then now people are really into it still, and you can go ahead and make a streaming exclusive spin-off or something. But as we've seen with other Matt Groening series like Futurama and Disenchantment, nothing has charmed the pants off the American public like The Simpsons did. We live in a different time now, one where The Simpsons isn't especially relevant. So why not send off the series with one last big to-do? Marge, Lisa, Maggie, Bart, and even Homer deserve at least that much respect.